It was late afternoon, that quiet hour when the house feels like it's breathing with you. I was in the kitchen, the smell of garlic and rosemary wrapping around me like a warm blanket. The light outside was fading, casting long shadows across the counter while I chopped vegetables, half humming to myself. That's when my phone lit up on the counter, an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. The moment I answered, I heard it. A trembling voice, the kind that makes your stomach drop before you even know why. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but I'm pregnant, and your husband is the father." My breath caught. The spoon in my hand clinked against the pot, a sound so sharp it cut right through the haze flooding my head. She said her name, Melissa, like it was the punchline to some cruel joke. And then, click. The line went dead. I stood there frozen, knife still in my hand but my grip weak. My mind raced, clawing for an explanation, some harmless misunderstanding I could cling to. But there was none. The silence in that kitchen was thick, pressing against me until I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The first thing I felt was shock, raw and suffocating. But beneath it, something darker started to burn. Suspicion. And right under that, a resolve I didn't yet recognize, but I knew it would change everything. I leaned against the counter, my palms flat on the cool granite, trying to anchor myself. The dinner I'd been making moments ago now smelled too strong, almost bitter in the air. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. At least not only from fear. It was the kind of tremble that comes when your mind is sprinting ahead of your body, already piecing together the moments you might have missed, the signs you ignored. Every late night, every vague excuse, every flicker of his eyes when I asked a simple question. They started lining up like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The name Melissa kept circling in my head, loud enough to drown out everything else. I didn't know her face, but now she felt like an uninvited shadow in my home. I imagined her voice again, shaking, almost apologetic, though I couldn't tell if it was guilt or pride that made it quiver. My mind began playing scenes that had never happened but felt real. David with her, somewhere that wasn't here, his hand on her back, whispering the same words he'd once said to me. I hated that my own imagination could betray me like that. I reached for my phone again, staring at the call log like the number might give me answers, but all it did was sit there, a silent dare on the screen. My first instinct was to call David right away, demand the truth, force it out of him before the lie could grow legs. But something in me, something I didn't quite trust yet, told me to wait, to breathe, to think. And that whisper inside, it was already starting to sound like a plan. I turned off the stove, letting the pan cool in the silence. My appetite was gone, replaced by a sharp awareness of every detail around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, the way the fading sunlight painted the walls in gold and shadow. Everything felt too still, as if the house was holding its breath along with me. I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream, cry, or just stand there until time started moving again. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear David's laugh, the one I used to love. And now it made my stomach twist. How long had I been living with a stranger? How many times had I looked him in the eyes without seeing what was right there? The thought hit me hard. Maybe this call wasn't a mistake or an accident. Maybe it was meant for me. A gift wrapped in cruelty, but still a gift. A chance to see the truth before it consumed me. I walked to the sink, rinsed my hands under the cold water, and looked at my reflection in the kitchen window. My face was pale, but my eyes, they didn't look broken. They looked alert, calculating. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as the light outside slipped away, so did any trace of the woman who'd just been cooking dinner, waiting for her husband to come home. Something new was settling in. Something that would carry me straight into what came next. That night I barely slept. I lay there in the dark, listening to David's steady breathing beside me, wondering how many lies were hidden in that calm rhythm. The phone in my nightstand drawer felt like it was burning through the wood, begging me to pick it up, to scroll through every message, every call, until I found her. But he'd changed his password a few weeks ago, claiming it was for work security. Back then, I'd let it slide. Now, it felt like a padlock on the truth. When the morning light spilled into the room, it wasn't warm. It was sharp, almost surgical, cutting through every excuse he'd ever given me. I watched him get dressed for work, his tie perfectly knotted, his cologne thick in the air. That same cologne that suddenly made my skin crawl. He kissed my cheek like nothing had changed. But something had. Everything had. I smiled back, because I knew now that pretending was my most powerful weapon. The moment the door shut behind him, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee notebook open. I started writing down every odd detail from the last few months. The sudden, urgent meetings, the dinners with clients, the unexplained withdrawals from our bank account. I connected them like dots on a map, and the picture they formed was ugly. I didn't have proof yet, but I could feel it in my bones. The call was real, and Melissa wasn't just a voice on the line. She was a storm already inside my life. I decided to test the waters. That afternoon, I called David at the office, asking something simple: what time he'd be home. His pause before answering was barely 2 seconds, but to me, it was an alarm bell. "Might be late." "A meeting ran over," he said, voice too casual, too rehearsed. I hung up and stared at the phone, my fingers drumming against the table. If I confronted him now, he'd have an excuse ready. Men like David always did. What I needed wasn't a fight. I needed evidence. By evening, I was online, scrolling through the websites of private investigators. It felt strange, like I was breaking some unspoken rule of marriage. But he'd already shattered those vows for me. I chose one with a reputation for discretion and a track record of results. When we spoke, I kept my voice steady, explaining the situation in the simplest terms. The man on the other end didn't sound surprised. "If she's pregnant and your husband's involved, we'll find out," he said. Something about the confidence in his tone settled me. The next few days were a blur of routine laced with anticipation. Every text from the investigator made my pulse quicken. I still played the part of the oblivious wife, smiling at dinner, asking about his day, pretending to believe every word. But inside, I was waiting for the moment the truth would arrive, neatly packaged, undeniable. When it came, I thought I was ready. I wasn't. The email landed in my inbox on a Thursday morning. No subject line, just an attachment. I opened it, and there they were, photo after photo of David with Melissa. Sometimes they were in broad daylight, other times under the soft glow of a street lamp. Her hand was on his arm in every single one, the kind of touch that doesn't belong to strangers. My throat went dry as I clicked through them, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The final image made me stop breathing. David, leaning down to kiss her, his wedding ring catching the light. Attached was the investigator's brief report, concise and brutal. They'd been meeting for months, restaurants, hotels. The withdrawals from our account? Gifts? Expensive ones? I read it twice, each word etching itself into my skin. It wasn't just a fling. It was a double life. The pregnancy call wasn't just real. It was the tip of the iceberg. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall, feeling the burn of betrayal settle deeper than I thought possible. But under that pain, something sharper began to take shape. This wasn't going to be a screaming match or a tearful plea. No, I'd make sure David's betrayal cost him far more than a marriage. And for that, I'd need time. And a plan. The hardest part was acting like nothing had changed. Every morning, I poured his coffee, kissed him goodbye, and watched him walk out the door as if my hands weren't itching to shove the photos in his face. But patience, I told myself, was a weapon. I started making quiet trips to the bank, copying every financial document I could get my hands on. Tax returns, account statements, property deeds. Each paper felt like a brick, and I was building a wall between us, one he wouldn't be able to climb when the time came. I met with my lawyer in a discreet office across town, a place David would never think to look. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across the page as I laid everything out. When I showed her the photos and played the recorded call, her brow arched just slightly. "You've got more than enough to protect yourself," she said. "Now it's about making sure he can't touch what's yours." I walked out of there with a new sense of clarity and a strategy. It was during those meetings that I learned something I hadn't expected. Melissa had a history, a pattern. She'd been involved with married men before, always in relationships that came with money attached. She wasn't just after David, she was after a lifestyle. That made me furious, but also oddly calm. If she thought she was playing a game, she hadn't realized I'd already started rewriting the rules. At home, I became an observer in my own marriage. I studied his movements, his tone, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked the simplest questions. Every lie he told was like a loose thread, and I was pulling them one by one, unraveling the fabric of the life we'd built. He didn't notice. He thought he was still in control. That was the part that almost made me smile. Almost. I began to shift money quietly, moving what I could into accounts he didn't know about. My lawyer helped me draft documents that would freeze joint access the moment I gave the word. Each step was precise, deliberate. There was no rush. Revenge, I realized, is sweeter when it's patient. At night, I'd lie awake beside him, listening to him breathe, knowing he had no idea the ground beneath him was already cracking. Sometimes I wondered what Melissa would think if she knew what was coming. Would she panic? Run? Or would she stay, convinced she could win? Either way, I was done being the woman in the dark. I wasn't just preparing to confront them. I was preparing to end them, at least in the version of life they'd been living at my expense. The more I planned, the lighter I began to feel. Not happy, not yet, but stronger, like I'd taken back a part of myself I didn't even know I'd lost. I started walking in the mornings, using the quiet streets as my thinking space. Each step was a reminder that I wasn't powerless. I was the one holding the cards now, and every day, I was stacking the deck higher in my favor. One morning, I passed a boutique and stopped, staring at my reflection in the glass. My eyes looked sharper, my posture straighter. I realized I wasn't just preparing for an ending. I was preparing for a beginning. A life where I didn't have to second-guess every word from his mouth. A life that was mine alone. That thought carried me through the rest of the day like a secret I couldn't wait to reveal. Still, there was a final piece missing. The moment. The one perfect scene where the truth would spill out, not in whispers or accusations, but in a way that left no room for denial. I didn't know when or how it would happen yet, but I knew when it did, David wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The night I chose was ordinary on the surface, at least for him. David walked through the door right on schedule, setting his briefcase by the couch like he always did. What he didn't expect was me sitting in the living room, every light on, a stack of papers on the coffee table, and my lawyer in the armchair across from me. His smile faltered just slightly, but I caught it. He knew. Or at least he suspected. "Sit down," I said, my voice steady, almost polite. He tried to make a joke, something about the serious atmosphere, but it landed flat in the room's heavy air. I reached for the photos first, laying them out one by one like cards in a losing hand. Then I pressed play on my phone. The recording of Melissa's trembling voice filled the space, each word slicing through whatever script he'd prepared in his head. His shoulders slumped. At first he tried to deny it, fumbling for explanations. Then came the half-admission, the pathetic line about it being just a mistake, and how he still loved me. I leaned back, studying him as if he were a stranger. "Mistakes don't last 9 months," I said evenly. "You've made your choice. Now live with it." I slid the divorce papers across the table, the pen resting neatly on top. His eyes darted to my lawyer, then back to me, as if waiting for some sign that this was negotiable. It wasn't. "You'll see the terms are already in place," my lawyer said, her tone calm but unyielding. "Joint accounts are closed. Access to shared assets has been revoked. All that's left is your signature." David blinked, processing the fact that the game was already over. He reached for the papers, but not before trying one last plea. "Elena, we can work through this," he said, his voice softer now, almost desperate. "I was stupid. I let things get out of hand. She doesn't mean anything to me." I watched him closely, noting how quickly he'd switched from defiance to begging. It wasn't love in his voice. It was the fear of losing comfort. I didn't raise my voice, didn't shed a tear. "You gave her gifts, David. You gave her time, affection, and now a child. You've already made your investment. I suggest you follow it through." His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but no words came. The silence between us said more than anything else could. He signed. Not right away, but slowly, as if each letter of his name was an admission he didn't want to make. When the pen left the paper, I slid the documents back toward my lawyer without breaking eye contact. "We'll be in touch," she said, gathering them neatly into her folder. David sat there, his hands clasped, staring at the table like it might give him an escape. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. I stood, smoothing the front of my dress, feeling lighter than I had in months. "You should go pack a bag," I told him, my voice even. "You won't be sleeping here tonight." The look on his face was a mix of disbelief and panic, as if he was only just realizing that every door he thought he had left open was now locked tight. As I watched him leave, I didn't feel triumphant or bitter. What I felt was control, the kind of steady, unshakable calm that comes when you've taken your life back, piece by piece. But I knew the story wasn't over. There would be calls. Please. Maybe even apologies, and I was ready for every single one. The first call came 3 days later. I didn't answer, then another and another. By the end of the week, my voicemail was full, each message a different version of the same plea. "We can fix this. It was a mistake. She's not who I thought she was." His voice sounded smaller each time, stripped of the confidence he used to wear like a second skin. I listened to a few, not out of hope, but to remind myself why I'd walked away. Melissa had left him. That much was clear from the fragments he let slip. Apparently, once she realized the lifestyle she'd been chasing wasn't coming, she'd moved on. I imagined her packing up the gifts he'd bought with our money, sliding them into her purse without a second thought. For her, it was just the end of another round. For David, it was the beginning of a very long fall. I spent those days reclaiming my own space, rearranging the furniture, clearing out drawers he'd left behind. It wasn't about erasing him. It was about breathing again. Every room felt different without his presence, like the air had shifted, lighter and cleaner. For the first time in months, I could stand in my kitchen without hearing Melissa's voice echo in my mind. One afternoon, I found myself at the seaside cafe I used to visit with friends years ago. The wind carried the scent of salt and espresso, and the sound of the waves seemed to wash away the last traces of him. I sat at a small table by the window, watching sailboats drift lazily across the horizon. Across from me was Claire, my oldest friend, her laughter filling the space between sips of coffee. With her, I didn't have to explain or defend anything. She already knew, and she approved. At some point, my phone buzzed on the table. David's name lit up the screen, a familiar reminder of a life I'd already left behind. Claire raised an eyebrow, silently asking if I'd answer. I smiled, turned the phone face down, and kept talking. His calls no longer felt urgent. They felt irrelevant. The grip he once had on my thoughts was gone, replaced by the quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. We talked for hours, about everything except him. Plans for a trip, the new book I'd started, how the sea air made the coffee taste even better. I realized I wasn't just moving on. I was already gone. The only thing left was to decide how I wanted to close this chapter, and I knew exactly how it would end. The decision came as naturally as breathing. I didn't need a dramatic finale, no public confrontation or cutting remark. My silence was enough. That evening, back at home, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the last light of day spilling across the room. My phone lit up again with his name. I let it ring until it stopped, then turned it face down on the table. He could keep calling for the rest of his life, but I'd already answered in the only way that mattered, by moving on. Somewhere, Melissa was carrying his child. That was his reality now, not mine. She could have him, the promises, the lies, the endless games. I didn't want any of it. What I had now was infinitely better. Peace. The kind that doesn't need to be defended or explained. The kind that settles into your bones and stays. I took a long sip of my tea, watching the moon rise over the rooftops. She can have the baby, I thought, a faint smile tugging at my lips. I'll keep my peace. And with that, I let the night take me, feeling lighter than I had in years, ready for whatever came next, because this time it would be mine.
Dr. Richard Porter's face drained of color as he flipped through the folder I placed in front of him. His manicured fingers trembled slightly, disturbing the careful arrangement of luxury pens on his desk. "This can't be right," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "There must be some mistake." "I ran the tests myself," I replied calmly. "Twice. No mistake, Richard. Stage 3 pancreatic adenocarcinoma with vascular involvement." Porter looked up, really seeing me for the first time since I'd entered his office. "Dr. Hayes," he said, attempting to regain his composure. "I wasn't aware you were handling my case personally. I wasn't supposed to be, I admitted, but when I saw your name on the patient roster, I felt it was appropriate." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. 3 years ago, Richard Porter had stood in this same office, though I had been on the other side of the desk then, and explained with practiced sympathy why Cedars Memorial Hospital couldn't approve my wife's experimental treatment. Insurance limitations, budget constraints, protocol restrictions. His words had been a death sentence delivered with corporate politeness. "My name is Dr. Michael Hayes. At 45, I had spent my career in oncology research until my wife Sarah's diagnosis with an aggressive form of leukemia had pulled me back into clinical practice. After her death, I had thrown myself into my work, eventually becoming one of the country's leading specialists in difficult-to-treat cancers. 6 months ago, I had accepted the position of Chief of Oncology at Cedars Memorial, the same hospital where Sarah had died, the same hospital still run by the man who had denied her last chance at survival. Some called it masochism. Others suspected revenge. I preferred to think of it as unfinished business. "Well," Porter said, closing the file with forced casualness, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but I'll be transferring my care to Memorial Sloan Kettering. I have colleagues there who specialize in pancreatic cancer." Of course, I nodded. "That's your right. Though I should mention that Dr. Abrams at Sloan Kettering was my mentor. We consult on cases weekly, and he's currently on sabbatical in Switzerland." Porter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Johns Hopkins, then." "Dr. Chen. We co-authored the most recent paper on the experimental protocol you'd need. She'd just refer you back to me." A flash of understanding crossed Porter's face. "You've been planning this?" he accused, a hint of fear breaking through his corporate veneer. "You took this position knowing that eventually every powerful man faces his mortality?" I finished for him. "No, but I did take this position knowing that I could prevent what happened to Sarah from happening to others." Porter stood abruptly, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. "This is unprofessional. I'll speak with the board about your conduct. By all means, I gestured toward his phone. Though you might want to read page 7 of your file first, the section on treatment options. His hand hesitated over the phone. Curiosity or fear won out. He reopened the file, turning to the page I'd indicated. As you can see, I explained as he read, standard protocols for your specific case have a 17% 5-year survival rate. Not particularly encouraging. Porter's face had gone ashen. And this experimental approach? He asked, pointing to the second option. 83% in initial trials, I said. It's the same treatment protocol Sarah needed. The one you denied as too experimental and not cost-effective. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. If this is some twisted form of revenge, Porter began. Revenge will be denying you treatment, I interrupted, my voice level. Revenge will be watching you navigate the same bureaucratic nightmare you've created for thousands of patients. Revenge will be easy, Richard. I stood straightening my white coat. But I took an oath, the same one you took before you decided hospital administration was more lucrative than actually treating patients. First, do no harm. Porter sank back into his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. The great equalizer, disease, had brought one of Philadelphia's most powerful healthcare executives to the same vulnerable position as the patients whose care he reduced to numbers on spreadsheets. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. Reform, I replied simply, beginning with approval of the Compassionate Care Initiative I submitted to the board last month, the one you've been blocking. Full funding for our clinical trials program, and your public support for the policy changes that would prevent insurance denials for experimental treatments when standard options fail. You're blackmailing me. I shook my head. I'm offering you the best medical care available, regardless of costs, exactly what I'd offer any patient. The policy changes aren't for my benefit, they're for the patients who will come after you. I placed a second folder on his desk. This contains the consent forms for treatment, along with the policy amendments I've drafted for the board. Take the weekend to review everything. My team begins the first treatment cycle on Monday morning. As I turned to leave, Porter called after me. Hayes, I paused at the door. If I refuse? I looked back at him, allowing myself a small, sad smile. Then you'll receive the current standard of care for someone with your diagnosis and insurance limitations. Nothing more, nothing less. Exactly what Sarah received. The executive wing of Cedars Memorial Hospital had always seemed like a separate universe from the medical floors, all mahogany paneling and tasteful artwork, designed to impress donors and comfort board members who rarely ventured into the actual hospital corridors. Dr. Elena Patel, my deputy and longtime friend, waited for me by the elevator. Well, she asked as the doors closed. He'll agree, I replied, the confidence in my voice masking the turmoil beneath. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Elena studied my face. Are you sure you can do this, Michael? Treat the man well. Yes, I said firmly. I have to. When Sarah had been diagnosed 3 years ago, I had still been primarily a research oncologist, working on experimental protocols that showed promise for treatment-resistant cancers. Her leukemia had initially responded to conventional approaches, but when it returned aggressively, the only hope had been an immunotherapy trial I'd helped develop. Porter, recently appointed as CEO, had been implementing a new fiscal responsibility framework. Sarah's treatment had become a casualty of his policies, deemed too expensive, too experimental for the hospital to justify to their insurance partners. By the time I had arranged alternative options at another institution, her condition had deteriorated beyond the point of eligibility. I had watched my brilliant, vibrant wife slip away over 6 agonizing weeks. Porter had sent flowers to her funeral, hospital policy for employees' family members. The board meeting is Wednesday, Elena reminded me as we exited onto the oncology floor. A world of beeping monitors, hushed conversations, and the distinct antiseptic smell that no amount of air freshener could disguise. If Porter supports the initiative, we could change everything. When he supports it, I corrected. He doesn't have a choice. Monday morning arrived with the controlled chaos typical of a hospital beginning its week. I had been at Cedars since 5 a.m., reviewing cases and preparing for Porter's treatment. When he arrived, escorted by a private nurse, his typical commanding presence had already diminished. Whether from the reality of his diagnosis or the knowledge of his precarious position with me, I couldn't tell. Dr. Hayes, he acknowledged stiffly. Richard, I replied, using his first name deliberately. I see you've met Nurse Okafor. She'll be your primary during treatment. I've brought the signed paperwork, he said, handing me both folders. All of it. I reviewed the documents quickly, consent for treatment, and more importantly, his written endorsement of the policy changes I proposed, ready for Wednesday's board meeting. Excellent, I said, handing the policy documents to Elena. Let's get you settled and begin the protocol. Over the next hour, Porter experienced the reality most patients face, changing into a hospital gown, surrendering his autonomy to medical staff, becoming a body to be treated rather than a person in control. I explained each step of the protocol in detail, watching as he processed the information not as a hospital administrator but as a frightened patient. This is the same treatment Sarah needed, he asked as Nurse Okafor inserted his IV line. A refined version, I answered. We've improved the response rate since then. His eyes met mine. Would it have saved her? The question hung in the air between us. 3 years of grief, anger, and professional determination compressed into 6 words. Probably, I said finally. We'll never know. The first round of treatment proceeded smoothly. Porter tolerated the initial medications well, and the specialized immunotherapy components were scheduled for day 3. As we concluded, I updated his chart while Elena checked his vital signs. The board chairman called. Elena informed me quietly as Porter dozed. He's confirmed the special session for Wednesday to review the policy changes. Good, I nodded. Everything's proceeding as planned. What I didn't tell Elena was how seeing Porter as a patient, vulnerable, afraid, clutching at hope the same way Sarah had, was affecting me. I had anticipated satisfaction, perhaps even a grim sense of justice. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that didn't fit neatly into categories like revenge or redemption. Wednesday morning found me standing before the hospital board, Porter seated among them, looking noticeably more haggard than his usual polished self. The effects of Sunday and Monday's treatments were evident in his pallor and a slight tremor in his hands. The Compassionate Care Initiative, I began, represents a fundamental shift in how Cedars Memorial approaches cases that fall outside standard treatment protocols. Rather than defaulting to denial based on cost considerations, we propose a multidisciplinary review process that prioritizes patient outcomes over short-term financial metrics. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. This philosophy directly contradicted the approach Porter had championed for years. The data is clear. I continued displaying slides that showed both medical outcomes and long-term financial implications. When we invest in innovative treatments, even expensive ones, we not only save lives but ultimately reduce costs through shorter hospital stays, fewer complications, and enhanced institutional reputation. I outlined the specific policy changes, the funding mechanisms, and the oversight committee structure that would ensure responsible implementation. Then, with perfect theatrical timing, I turned to Porter. CDO Porter has reviewed these proposals in detail and has prepared remarks on their financial viability. All eyes turned to him. This was the moment. Would he honor our agreement or attempt to undermine the initiative he had opposed for so long? Porter rose slowly, the effort clearly taxing him. 3 days ago, he began, his voice less commanding than usual. I received a diagnosis that many would consider a death sentence. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Few had known of his condition. Dr. Hayes is treating me with an experimental protocol, one that would have been denied under our current policies. He paused, gathering himself. The same type of protocol that was denied to his wife under my leadership. The room fell silent. I have spent my career focused on fiscal discipline and operational efficiency, Porter continued. Those aren't inherently wrong goals, but they're incomplete. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why we're here, not to manage a profitable business, but to save lives. He detailed his support for my initiative, emphasizing both its humanitarian and long-term financial benefits. By the time he finished speaking, several board members were nodding in agreement. The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, Porter approached me in the hallway. The board members had treated him with that peculiar combination of deference and pity reserved for the powerful when they fall ill. Their voices a little too loud, their encouragement a little too emphatic. "That went well," he said, attempting his usual authoritative tone but failing to mask his exhaustion. "It did," I agreed. "Your support was convincing." He studied me for a moment. When I realized what you were doing, positioning yourself to control my treatment, I thought it was about revenge, making me suffer the way your wife did. That would have been easier, I admitted. Then why this approach? Why help change the system rather than just punishing me? I considered the question carefully. Sarah was a structural engineer, I said finally. She used to tell me that when a building fails, you can patch the visible damage, but unless you fix the fundamental flaws in the framework, it will eventually collapse again. Porter nodded slowly, and I was a fundamental flaw. Your policies were, I corrected. You were just a symptom of a larger problem. A healthcare system that values balance sheets over human lives. We stood in silence for a moment, the hospital continuing its relentless rhythm around us. Your next treatment is tomorrow morning, I said, turning to leave. Get some rest, Richard. The protocol is demanding, but the results are worth it. Hayes, he called after me. Would you have treated me even if I hadn't agreed to support your initiative? I paused, considering the question that had haunted me since discovering his diagnosis. The answer mattered, not just to Porter, but to my own understanding of who I had become in the aftermath of Sarah's death. Yes, I said finally, because that's the difference between us. You saw Sarah as a budget item. I see you as a patient. 6 months later, Richard Porter stood at the podium in the hospital's main auditorium. Addressing the staff and media gathered for the official launch of the Cedars Memorial Compassionate Care Center, a dedicated wing for patients requiring experimental or specialized treatments regardless of insurance status. His cancer was responding well to the protocol. The latest scans showed significant tumor reduction, and while he wasn't out of danger, his prognosis had improved dramatically. He had lost weight, and his designer suits hung loosely on his frame, but his voice had regained some of its former strength. This center represents a new direction for Cedars, and we hope, for healthcare institutions nationally, he announced. Under the leadership of Dr. Michael Hayes, we have already accepted 15 patients who would previously have been denied care under our old policies. From my seat in the front row, I watched the man who had once prioritized profit margins above patient outcomes champion a system built on the opposite philosophy. Was it genuine conversion or simply self-preservation? Perhaps a bit of both. After the ceremony, as staff and board members mingled over catered refreshments, Porter approached me with 2 flutes of champagne. Sparkling cider, he clarified, handing me one. My oncologist has strong opinions about alcohol during treatment. I accepted the glass with a small smile. Your oncologist sounds wise. Occasionally insufferable, but yes, wise. He gestured toward the plaque outside the new center. The board wanted to name it after me, the Porter Center for Compassionate Care. I suggested an alternative. I followed his gaze to the engraved nameplate, the Sarah Hayes Center for Compassionate Care. I hope that's acceptable, he said, watching my reaction carefully. The gesture caught me off guard. In all the scenarios I had imagined when I'd taken this position, all the ways I had thought this story might end, this hadn't been among them. Sarah would have appreciated the irony, I said finally, raising my glass slightly, to unintended legacies. Porter nodded, clinking his glass against mine, and to second chances, medical and otherwise. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office, looking at Sarah's photograph on my desk. The grief remained a permanent fixture in my life, but it had changed shape over time, less raw, more purposeful. When I had accepted the position at Cedars, many of my colleagues had assumed I was seeking revenge against Porter and the system that had failed my wife. Perhaps that had been part of it, but Sarah had always believed in fixing broken things rather than simply assigning blame to their failure. The center bears the name which treats hundreds of patients who would otherwise fall to the path of our toxic healthcare system. Patients who, like Porter, had received care based on medical needs rather than financial calculations. It wasn't justice, nothing could truly balance the scales after Sarah's death. But it was something better, something more enduring than revenge. It was change. I tucked Sarah's photo into my bag and turned off the office light. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and another treatment session for Porter. The work continued, not just treating disease, but treating the flawed systems that too often determined who lived and who died. In medicine, we're taught that proper diagnosis is the essential first step in effective treatment. What I had diagnosed wasn't just Porter's cancer, but the cancer within the system itself. And sometimes, treating the disease requires starting with the most visible symptom, even when that symptom wears expensive suits and sits behind a mahogany desk. The violation notice trembled slightly in my hand as Councilman Wells strutted back to his luxury SUV, shooting me that practiced politician's smile that never reached his eyes. Around me, the Saturday morning farmers market continued in full swing, now with the added spectacle of watching my dream collapse in public. Miss Vega, one of my regular suppliers, an elderly farmer named Gil, approached cautiously. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile, tucking the notice into my jacket pocket. "Just city politics, Gil. The usual nonsense." But it wasn't the usual anything. This was the culmination of a targeted campaign against Roots, my farm-to-table restaurant that had become the unexpected darling of Harborview's culinary scene over the past 3 years. The notice cited unapproved agricultural activities on the restaurant's rooftop garden and patio, a garden that had passed inspection just 6 months earlier. My name is Sofia Vega, and at 38, I had transformed an abandoned warehouse in Harborview's struggling waterfront district into a restaurant that celebrated local food and the farmers who grew it. Every weekend, I personally selected ingredients at this farmer's market, building relationships with suppliers, and creating seasonal menus that had earned us national recognition. That success had put me squarely in the crosshairs of Councilman Jeffrey Wells and the development company he quietly represented, Coastal Hospitality Group, a corporate behemoth determined to transform our historic waterfront into a playground of luxury hotels and chain restaurants. "They're just getting started, aren't they?" The voice belonged to Meera Patel, owner of the independent bookstore next to Roots. She had appeared at my elbow, eyes fixed on Wells' departing vehicle. "Looks that way," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emergency meeting tonight?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "My place. 8 o'clock. As Meera walked away, I continued selecting produce for that evening's service, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while my mind raced. The waterfront merchants had been meeting regularly since Wells and his allies on the city council had revealed their revitalization plan 6 months ago. A plan that conveniently required pushing out established local businesses in favor of corporate chains and luxury developments. That night, the back room of my apartment above the restaurant filled with familiar faces, restaurant owners, shopkeepers, local artisans, and others who had built the waterfront district into the vibrant community it had become. "They're picking us off one by one," said Omar, who ran the vintage record store on Harbor Street. "First it was permit issues for Jason's art gallery, then those ridiculous noise complaints against the music venue, and now zoning violations for Roots." "It's not just violations," I said, pulling out the notice. "They're demanding I remove the entire rooftop garden and patio area within 10 days or face daily fines of $1,000. "That's impossible," Meera exclaimed. "The garden is integral to your restaurant concept." "Exactly." I took a deep breath. "And that's not all. Yesterday, I received this." I pulled out a formal letter and passed it around. An offer from Coastal Hospitality Group to purchase Roots for approximately half its actual value. The room erupted in angry exclamations, but I raised my hand for silence. This isn't unexpected. We've all known what Wells and his developer friends have been planning. What they don't know is that we've been planning too. I nodded to Marco, a former investigative journalist who now owned the coffee shop down the street. He opened his laptop and began a presentation that silenced the room. "For the past 6 months, we've been building a case," he explained, displaying documents, photographs, and transcripts on the screen. "Councilman Wells has been accepting bribes from Coastal Hospitality while using city resources to target businesses that refuse to sell." The evidence was damning: recorded conversations between Wells and Coastal executives, bank transfers to offshore accounts, falsified inspection reports, and internal emails discussing which businesses to target first. "How did you get all this?" Omar asked, stunned. Marco smiled grimly. "Let's just say that developers aren't the only ones who can hire people with technical skills. Plus, it's amazing what people will say when they think no one's listening. We're taking this to the FBI, I announced. They've been building a public corruption case against several members of the city council, and our evidence completes their investigation." "Why wait until now?" asked Jason from the art gallery. My business has been closed for 3 months. We needed enough evidence to ensure charges would stick, Marco explained. And we needed them to get explicitly corrupt with Sofia. Her restaurant is the crown jewel they want for their development, and Wells finally got careless enough to threaten her directly. I pulled out my phone and played a recording from 2 days earlier, Wells' voice clear and unambiguous. The zoning board does what I tell them to Sofia. Sell to Coastal now, or I'll make sure Roots is shut down permanently. Nobody defies me in my district. The meeting continued late into the night as we finalized our strategy. By morning we had a clear plan, one that would not just expose the corruption, but ensure our community could rebuild stronger than before. The next day, I operated Roots as if nothing had changed, welcoming the Sunday brunch crowd with my standard enthusiasm. What the customers couldn't see was the meeting taking place in a private dining room, where FBI agents were reviewing our evidence and preparing to move. At 3:00 p.m., I received a text from Marco. It's happening. Turn on the news. I stepped into my office and switched on the small television just in time to see live footage of FBI agents entering City Hall during an emergency council meeting. A meeting Wells had called specifically to fast-track the waterfront redevelopment plan. The cameras captured Wells' face as agents approached the council dais, his expression shifting from confusion to panic as they announced the charges. Bribery, corruption, extortion, and misuse of public office. By evening, the story had exploded across local and national news. 3 council members, 2 city inspectors, and 4 executives from Coastal Hospitality Group had been detained for questioning. Wells himself had been arrested in full view of the cameras, his carefully crafted political image shattered in an instant. I closed the restaurant early that night, gathering my staff to explain what had happened. They had known something was wrong, but hadn't been privy to our investigation or counter-strategy. So what happens now? Asked Alina, my head chef and closest friend. Even with Wells gone, the violation notice still exists. Actually, it doesn't, I smiled, showing her an email from the city manager's office. All recent citations against waterfront businesses are being reviewed due to potential improprieties in the inspection process. You planned all of this, she said, shaking her head in amazement. While they thought they were hunting you, you were hunting them. Not just me, I corrected. All of us, the entire waterfront community. Wells thought he could pick us off individually, but he never understood that we're stronger together. The following weeks brought sweeping changes to Harborview. With Wells and his allies removed from office, the city council underwent a transformation. Special elections were scheduled, and several waterfront business owners, including Mira, announced their candidacies. The revitalization plan was suspended pending a complete review, with community input prioritized in any future development decisions. Coastal Hospitality Group withdrew from Harborview entirely, their reputation tarnished by the corruption scandal. 6 months later, I stood on Roots' rooftop garden, now expanded and thriving, hosting a community celebration. The waterfront district had not just survived but was flourishing, with new businesses opening in previously vacant spaces and a renewed sense of local pride. Marco joined me at the railing, overlooking the harbor as the sun began to set. Have you seen the news about Wells? He asked. I nodded. The former councilman had accepted a plea deal, providing evidence against larger development interests in exchange for a reduced sentence. His political career was over, his reputation destroyed. I never wanted revenge, I said thoughtfully, watching customers and community members mingle below. I just wanted to protect what we built. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, Marco replied. Wells thought he was so powerful that no one would dare stand against him. His arrogance was his weakness. And our strength was that we appeared weaker than we were, I added. We let him think he was winning until we had everything we needed to take him down completely. That evening, as I addressed the gathered crowd, I found myself reflecting on the journey. 3 years ago, when I opened Roots, I named it to honor where our food comes from, the soil, the farmers, the traditions. But now that name means something more. It represents our community's roots, too deep to be easily pulled up, too interconnected to be divided. I raised my glass. To Harborview, not just surviving, but thriving on our own terms. The following week, I received an unexpected visitor at the restaurant, the new interim mayor, a longtime city council critic who had been appointed after the scandal. Ms. Vega, she said, taking a seat at the bar during our afternoon lull. I've been reviewing the events that led to the corruption investigation. I tensed slightly, unsure where this conversation was heading. What you and the other business owners did was remarkable, she continued. You protected not just your livelihoods but the character and integrity of this city. We did what was necessary, I replied carefully. Which is why I'm here. She placed a folder on the bar. The city is establishing a waterfront preservation and development commission to ensure nothing like this happens again. We need people with both vision and backbone. People like you. I opened the folder to find an official appointment letter with my name on it. We're rebuilding trust, the mayor explained. Who better to help than those who exposed the corruption in the first place? 1 year to the day after Wells had delivered his violation notice, I stood in City Hall as the newly formed commission unveiled its plan for the waterfront, a balanced approach that preserved the district's character while allowing for thoughtful growth and improvement. The farmers' market where Wells had threatened me was now permanently established in a renovated waterfront pavilion. Jason's art gallery had reopened with a city-sponsored exhibition space for local artists. Mira's bookstore had expanded to include a community meeting center. And Roots? We were stronger than ever. Our rooftop garden, now a registered urban agriculture site that hosted educational programs for local schools. The restaurant had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that sometimes, when people try to uproot you, they only make your foundation stronger. That night after closing, I watered the herbs and vegetables that grew in organized rows across our rooftop. The violation notice that had once threatened this space was now framed in my office, a reminder that power doesn't always reside where people think it does. Wells had believed his position gave him the right to decide who succeeded in Harborview and who failed. He never understood that true strength comes not from title or authority, but from community and conviction, the perfect ingredients for something that can't be bought, bullied, or broken. As I looked out over the waterfront, lights twinkling against the dark water, I smiled at how thoroughly Wells' plan had backfired. He had wanted to transform our community into something that served his interests. Instead, he had inadvertently united us into something stronger than we had been before, proving once again that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance isn't fighting back immediately, but watching, waiting, and choosing the perfect moment to reveal that you were never as vulnerable as they thought.